You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. I'm your host, Will Compernell. Federal policy changes have complicated the budgets of universities and colleges, and not just for the Ivy League or flagship state schools. Institutions at all levels are working to plug budget shortfalls from federal spending cuts, new endowment taxes, and the possibility of fewer international students. On today's episode, we talk with David Jesse, senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education, about the ways the federal government supports higher education, the financial pressures universities and colleges will face from new policy changes, and how these institutions might choose to adapt in the years ahead. Just a quick heads up for complete context, this interview was conducted before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was passed, and the final version of the law adopts the Senate proposal for the endowment tax we discussed during the interview. Stay tuned. Coming up soon, our interview with David Jesse, but first, a quick market update. President Trump and other senior Republicans continued to criticize Chair Powell and the rest of the Fed over the last 2 weeks, drawing attention to construction cost overruns for renovations at the Fed's headquarters. There were reports the president went as far as drafting a letter to fire Powell, which caused treasuries to twist steeper on the expectation that less Fed independence would mean a lower Fed funds rate in the short term, but higher inflation in the long term. Powell's term officially ends next May, but the persistent criticism has cast doubt on the durability of the Fed's ability to decide policy without any political pressure. Fed Governor Chris Waller expressed explicit support for a rate cut this month, arguing tariff-induced inflation risks would be temporary and Fed policy should support the cooling labor market. Waller and fellow Governor Mickey Bowman have thus far been outliers within the FOMC in supporting a rate cut next week. Nevertheless, Waller's comments marginally increased market expectations for Fed easing this year. The June CPI showed evidence of tariff pass-through to consumer prices, though the broader indexes reported another month of solid disinflation. Fed officials are reluctant to cut rates right now not because of what the existing data say, but because of what future months might say. As a result, the cool CPI and PPI last week failed to increase investor confidence in imminent Fed easing. The U.S. struck new agreements with a handful of trading partners this week ahead of the new August 1st deadline for the so-called reciprocal tariffs. The tariff rates imposed on imports from Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and potentially the EU will be lower than the maximum rates first proposed in April, but will still push the average effective tariff rate on U.S. imports to the highest since 1933. Treasury yields across the curve have stayed range-bound the last 2 weeks as investors wait for a clearer inflection point in the economic data, the Fed reaction function, or political developments before setting decisive new anchors. 10-year yields have moved between 4.32% and 4.48% since the June jobs report was released on July 3rd. The spread on 2s and 10s has been between 40 and 65 basis points since the April 9th pause of the tariffs announced April 2nd. Fed funds futures are pricing in just under 2 rate cuts by the end of this year, with the first cut fully priced in at the October decision. That's all for the market update this time. Now, our interview with David Jesse. Our guest today is David Jesse, senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. David, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Our topic today is the financial landscape for higher education, particularly in the wake of new federal policies. Now, I think it's helpful to point out the diversity of institutions and student experiences before we get into the nuts and bolts of these new policies. I get the sense that so much of how higher ed is portrayed in the movies or the news is really not representative of the typical American college experience. So, David, let me know if you want to add anything or if I have this totally wrong. But I feel like so much attention goes to the top 30 or so colleges that are highly selective, have pretty sizable endowments, and consist almost entirely of people who are full-time students and live on campus. But there's almost no attention given to, for example, the 40% of undergraduate degrees given by community colleges, or the small liberal arts schools that have worked really hard to build up a small endowment. David, do you think my description there is accurate? Anything to add or critique, or am I totally off here?
I think you're right on task there. So much of the attention of the media, and I'm a member of that media is paid to the Harvards and the Princetons, and certainly in popular culture, right? That's what we see portrayed. But, a lot of college students are going to those small private schools that you just mentioned, or they're going to a large regional public university where they're not paying very much in tuition. They may be living on campus, they may not. Lots of them commute in. They may be your kind of typical age, but more and more they're 22-year-old freshmen or 23-year-old freshmen or 28-year-old sophomores, right? And so much of what we think of when we think of college isn't necessarily right. I think it's good to start this conversation by kind of broadening our understanding of who's going to school and where they're going.
I think it is helpful context as we talk about a lot of these topics because there are such a wide variety of financial environments that higher ed institutions and students have, and it's easy for the whole conversation to boil down to, the federal government versus one particular university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But let's start off with the basics. Any higher education institution will get funding from a few places: tuition, from states, alumni donations. How big of a share is the money from the federal government for these higher education institutions?
It really depends. In large research universities, not only Harvard, but think the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, think the University of Texas at Austin, think the University of California, Berkeley, those big places, they're going to receive hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government to fund research. And that's important because not only does it fund research, but then through the indirect costs, and we can talk about indirect costs later, tacked on to those agreements, they're also funding the janitor who cleans the building. They're funding the HR person who's hiring and doing training and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of ways that the federal money flows into a college or a university.
So is it earmarked for research? Let's say you get a grant for X amount of dollars, and then the university does everything that's needed to support that research, which includes, paying the janitor, paying the HR person. How many strings are attached to this funding typically?
It's known as indirect costs. And basically, there's a really complex mathematical formula that goes into figuring out how much money the federal government will pay in addition to the grant. So I decide I want to apply for, I don't know, say $100,000 grant on studying, do left-handers make better baskets when weaving with reeds on the shores of Lake Michigan? I don't know, whatever, right? So they're going to award me that grant, and then they're going to award on top of that a percentage of that money to cover indirect costs, like we were just talking about, the HR person, et cetera, et cetera. Those rates are negotiated between the federal government and between the university, and they vary. So in some cases, they get 65%. And in some cases, they get much less than that. There's some train of thought now in the administration that they should all be capped at 15%. So you can see, I mean, right, if I'm getting $100,000 grant, or let's say $1 million grant, in addition getting 65% to cover all these indirect costs, if that drops down to 15%, right, and you multiply that by the number of researchers and the number of grants coming in, now we're talking some serious money on the line for these universities.
I think public-private partnerships have a really long track record of being behind a lot of our best innovation in the US and really globally. I will also say that a lot of research that looks to be silly or a failure at first actually contributes to our greater understanding of the world down the line. But going back to that example that you mentioned of left-handers weaving baskets, how often are these reviewed? Is it the Department of Education that is looking at these grants on a case-by-case basis? Is it Congress every year when they pass a fiscal package? What sort of oversight is there for how this money is being used?
So generally speaking, they have to submit reports, and they're not coming through the Department of Education Most of these research grants, they're coming through the Department of Defense, they're coming through the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Energy, the USDA, right, is funding research into better corn production, et cetera. So they're coming through these different agencies, and they're then in charge of reviewing just paperwork and stuff that has to be sent in to review that. I'm not aware of Congress, for example, doing any sort of deep dive, although in recent months, people have certainly been digging into various projects that have been funded and whether they're quote unquote appropriate for funding.
Before we talk a little bit more about what's going on in current events, going back to that question of the ways that federal money gets channeled into these higher education institutions, is research really the primary source, or sometimes could the University of Illinois get federal money to improve their athletic facility? Are there any other ways that the institutions themselves benefit from federal transfers that aren't research? And I'll talk a little bit more later about kind of the student centric approach, but what is there outside of research?
There's a variety of different grants funds that come in. They receive, I think it's called TRIO grants to help low income students with accessibility and support systems. There's funding for Title IX. There's a wide variety of funding that flow in. Federal funds are really intertwined into a college's budget, which makes it very hard if, say, Harvard or Jesse University decided, you know what, skip it. We're going to just get rid of all our federal funding and go it completely alone. We'll rely on our alumni and our donors and whatever partnerships we can find with foundations or other private folks.
So, what are the funding changes that we've seen so far, either realized or proposed from the Trump administration, or the spending bill that's working its way through Congress? Again, we'll go back to the fight between the White House and the Harvard that's taking up a lot of air in the room. But I imagine there are a lot of other decisions happening under the radar. So, what have we seen so far?
So the biggest one and the one that's causing the most concern is, well, the two. One is what happens, as we just talked about, with this indirect cost proposal, and is there some sort of cap that's put in place that says we're only willing to pay X amount of money for the assorted stuff that universities need to run research, but not directly do the research. That's a big deal. At the start, we've also seen a number of grants paused or awards funding for research paused or held off. And it seems like it changes daily on some of this, whether certain agencies are funding or they're not funding, or they're reviewing or they're not reviewing. And it's just led to a ton of uncertainty in universities. We're just coming out of university budget season. Universities' new budgets generally start on July 1st. And so these administrators and the boards and the presidents are trying to put together these budgets, and they just have no clue on a wide number of funding streams. The other one that's in the news here lately is an endowment tax. If you have over a certain amount per student, or a total endowment over a certain amount of money, there's an effort to increase a tax on that, and so that obviously would hit not only some of the name brand institutions, but some of the smaller privates who don't have a lot of students but have a healthy endowment. And so their endowment per student would trigger the tax. And a lot of this is really fluid, and it's why so many people are very carefully watching the big, beautiful bill to see what actually is going to end up when we're done with all the negotiations around it.
I want to talk a little bit more about endowments. I think they're really interesting and not totally well understood by most people in the public. So I read some of these stories about universities losing federal funding or massively increasing the sticker price for student tuition, and I never understand why they don't seem to touch their endowments. I will admit that I'm probably talking about those top 30 or so schools that I complained about earlier in the episode. So I know that not everywhere has big endowments, but why aren't these being used as a rainy day fund for places that suddenly lose funding? Isn't this the rainy day that endowments are set up for?
There are a lot of people who argue that. So there's a couple things to know about endowments. Endowments are generally split between unrestricted funds and restricted funds. So unrestricted funds I just give the university, I don't know, $10 million because they did a great job for me, set me up. I've made a ton of money, etc. I love them, so I'm just going to give them $10 million. I'm going to put no conditions on it. So that money could be transferred around wherever the university decides to use it. The bulk of the money comes in restricted funds. So I'm going to fund a scholarship at UCLA for, I live in Michigan. So for Michigan residents who want to go to UCLA, because I think getting to California, broaden horizons, and is a great thing. And so my money can only be spent on that purpose, right? And the idea of the endowment is that it stays around forever and it generates income. And so all universities will pool all that money together. They'll invest it somehow, private venture capital, a whole variety of stuff. And then they get their returns. And then they have what's known as a spending policy. And that spending policy generally says that between 3 and 5% of the proceeds every year are then kicked into the general fund as completely unrestricted. So, I send money for a scholarship, and so $20,000 of my money is going to go to a scholarship every year. That money is going to get lumped all together with everybody's gifts. It's going to generate income, but the university can only spend a set amount of that money into kind of the unrestricted general fund that would go to things like lowering tuition or covering research without the permission of the donor. So a university could always come back to you and say, hey, thanks for that gift of $100 million. I know you really wanted to go to a brand new planetarium, but we don't have that need right now, but we really need to fund this really important research into cancer, and we really need that money. Can we transfer some of your money to that? You can say yes or no. So that's where it gets kind of tricky. When I give a donation to the university, I sign a contract, they sign a contract. That's a legal binding document that says that money will only be spent on whatever. And so you'd have to go back and modify that. And a number of universities and a number of small colleges, particularly, have gotten in trouble when they have tried to take that endowment money and keep the university open without having permission of the donors.
I will say the fact that there are so many restrictions on a lot of endowment money. I'll speak for myself, but I do think that I represent the everyday person. I just had the idea that endowments were these big funds that were totally unrestricted, and they were just growing in a really quick way. These investments, and universities just didn't want to touch them for whatever reason. What sorts of tax advantages are there for these endowments? Do they operate like Roth IRAs where the gains are tax free? Are there any laws about how they need to be managed? I know a lot of nonprofits have to spend a certain amount of their endowment every year. Do those sorts of rules govern endowments for universities?
Yes and no. So they have to set a policy. And again, generally speaking, it's somewhere between 3 and 5% that they spend each year into their general fund. I'm unaware any cap to that. So, for example, a university board could decide, hey, look, this is super tough financially right now. We can't touch the corpus of your gift, but the interest that we're earning, we're going to spend all of that this coming year into the budget. So there are ways around it that way for a university to try.
A few questions ago, you mentioned this new proposed endowment tax. So, can you refresh what exactly that would apply to? And what is the thinking behind that other than to maybe raise a source of revenue? Is it to incentivize universities to spend more of their funding every year? Or is this really just a kind of way to raise money from universities?
I think it's both. It's kind of raising money. It's kind of punishing some of these elite universities. It's trying to get them to spend out. The House has a proposal that would tax it at 21%, I think, and the Senate is right around 8%. So there's a big difference there. There's a very tiered structure. Um, Depending on the value of their endowment per student. So there's a formula that would lead to it.
I want to talk about the importance of international students to universities' revenue. So, my understanding is that oftentimes they pay even more than US out of state students at public universities. Is there going to be a big financial impact here if fewer student visas are being issued?
So I live in Michigan. I live near Ann Arbor, so the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. So they're relatively inexpensive if you're an in-state undergraduate student. They subsidize that with two things. If you're an out-of-state student undergrad coming in, you're going to pay, it's a couple times more per year in tuition. And then if you're an international student, you're paying even more. And so they're subsidizing a lot of that low cost for their in-state students through these other channels. So if you pull out those international students, now you're going to have to do one of two things. You're going to have massive cuts to faculty and staff and programs, et cetera, or you're going to have to hike that tuition that your in-state students are paying. And remember, a lot of the international students are here as graduate students. Graduate education is much more costly anyways for students, even in-state students, and when you get to international, you're paying a significant amount of money, especially at these top-end schools. And so if you suddenly have that income either completely wiped away or drastically reduced, you're going to have to make it up somewhere, right? And so you're either going to have to generate more revenue, and the largest share of the university's revenue still comes from student tuition. So it's either got to come from there or it's got to come from cutting the budget to match.
Have we seen any formal proposals to cut the number of student visas being issued? I know that it's sort of wrapped up in this idea of stricter immigration enforcement. Is it still a vague in the abstract for now, or do we see, the number of H-1B visas or undergrad visas being reduced?
We haven't seen a number. They haven't said we're only letting 10,000 in or 40,000 or whatever. It is very much, as you said, wrapped up in the broader discussion of immigration, of not only the number of folks coming in, but who's coming in. The Department of State the other day saying that if you're coming in to America to go to college, before they're going to give a visa, you got to turn over access to all your social media accounts. They're going to go through and look at everything you've been posting. It's definitely tied up in that rhetoric fight, but we haven't seen an actual number.
Now, going back to the tax advantages that higher education institutions have, one idea that has been thrown out there is removing the tax exemption that a lot of them have because they're legally classified as nonprofits. Now, I imagine this is a huge tax bill that is now on the budgets of these institutions every year that they are not used to. What are the risks from that? How big of a tax advantage is that they are, considered nonprofits and tax exempt?
Well, it'd be a huge. I mean, just think of the property tax. Think of your favorite university and think of how much property it owns. It's always a bone of contention between the part of the split between town and gown, that these universities take a big chunk of land off the public tax rolls. If they put them back on, certainly, a number of cities would, towns and villages would cheer. But now places that own a lot of real estate would have to come up with money. And this is one where the big flagships, the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, right? Big sprawling campus, University of Alabama, Birmingham, huge properties. And that would hurt, but it also hurt, think of a small private school in a rural town. They're really the only thing. They're the big landowners. There might be some houses around and a little bit of downtown, but it's basically the college. And so what happens if they come back on the tax rolls? Well, it's a huge deal to the city. They get a bunch of revenue, but it's also a huge deal to the small liberal arts college who likely is already struggling because as a part of the overall higher education sector, that small bit is struggling the most, and so that could tip over some of the places into closing, which then would have ripple effects in those communities. So when we talk about some of these issues, it's not just, again, to go back to the start of our conversation, we tend to focus on how will this impact these massive institutions, but things like this would have maybe even a bigger effect on some of these really small places with 1,000 or 1,200 students.
We focused a lot on the institution centric approach, but I want to talk more about the federal government's involvement at the student centric level. So, the different types of grants and subsidies, how important are these to student financing? I guess off the top of my head, I think of things like federal student loans, Pell Grants, or even the GI Bill.
Right. This is where the bulk of folks get the funds to go to school, whether it is a Pell Grant, which is, for lower income students that is tied to your income, to the GI Bill, to, as you said, you got to take out a loan, right? I'm getting scholarships, I'm getting a variety of things, and I'm still $10,000 short this year. Well, where am I going to get that money? I'll go and I get this federally backed loan, which gives me a great interest rate and allows me to complete school. And so that's a huge deal. It's a huge deal to the colleges itself because it makes some of these universities, especially some of the pricier private universities, private colleges, more reachable for a wider variety of folks. You don't have to be a millionaire necessarily to send your son to Harvard if they get in. You can take these loans and get a better rate than you would if you were just going down to your local bank.
So, have we seen any potential policy changes in this way, either to cut the amount of funding or I believe federally backed student loans are tied to the interest rate awarded at a particular 10-year treasury auction at the same time each year. But are there any different conditions or spending cuts as a way to save money that we're seeing proposed?
We've seen a lot of folks who would like to see the federal government get out of the student loan business because that also means, they're putting up the money, they're taking on the risk, the federal government, the taxpayer, you and me. Some people don't pay back, and how do you go after them? There are those who would like that to be privatized and just to have the private market handle that. So there's a number of thoughts like that, floating around. There always are. We have not seen any concrete proposals.
All of the things that we've talked about, all these potential impacts to federal funding, either at the institution or student level, how do you think universities and smaller colleges make up for any of the shortfalls in funding in the short term? Do they raise revenue? Go to those budget meetings that you were talking about earlier. Is the short term solution to issue more debt, raise tuition fees, cut services, cut staff? What are they looking to do in the short term to adjust to any big changes?
All of the above. You're seeing tuition increase, but they don't want to increase tuition too much. In some cases, they can't because, for example, in Michigan, the state legislature sets a cap for how much the private university can raise tuition each year and still get state funding, which we haven't talked a lot about. But there's a number of states that are hurting or are also making cuts, and so that's kind of complicating things. They're loath to increase tuition very much. And again, it's just like you're in my household budget. If there's a shortfall, there's one of two ways to go about it. You can either get another job and raise more revenue coming in, or you can get rid of, Netflix and, Starbucks and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what we're seeing in most cases is the universities are cutting positions. The smart ones are trying to do it in targeted areas that are taking a very careful look at what one makes money for them, either in terms of direct revenue or bringing students in. You don't want to cut a program that's popular, and now you don't have as many students coming in. And so there's a lot of that going on. I was talking earlier this spring to the CFO at Washington State University about all of this, and she said they were going to every department and having them put together a series of percentage cuts. Like, if we have to cut you 2%, what does this look like? If we have to cut you 5%, what does this look like? If we have to cut you 10%, what does this look like? And so there's a lot of that going on. But I think the key word right now for the universities is uncertainty.
We hear a lot of that in the bond market, which is what a lot of our audience focuses on the most.
Certainly there will be universities that will go out and who think they can go out and get a short-term cash loan. A number of them have lines of credit, and so they might tap those a little bit or see if they can increase the lines of credit a little bit more. On the other hand, there's also some construction projects I would suspect that we're in the drawing stages that are going to be pushed down because they don't want to take on additional debt and have to make those increased debt payments. There's also, I would suspect a number of universities that will look to how can we refinance our debt? What can we do to bring the debt payment down? And there are obviously a number of ways of going about that.
So that's the short term. I want to end with looking at the long term. So looking into your crystal ball, it's possible that in 2 years, when the midterm elections, or in 4 years, when there will be a new president, a lot of these things could change. But long term, do you think any institutions are at risk of becoming insolvent? How do you think this all ends? Will there be some things overturned by the courts, or will there be a lot of scarring impacts no matter whether funding is returned, I don't know, by the end of the year or in 4 years or 10 years?
I don't know that there will be any public universities that will close. It would take a lot for that to happen. And I think your use of the word scarring is appropriate, because once you get rid of programs and people, it's hard to bring them back, right? It's hard to justify now increasing the expenditures. And I don't think that we would see kind of the reverse in 2 years or 4 years, where all of a sudden universities would go on a spending spree. I think we're going to see some scarring. I think we're going to see programs go away. I think we might see less research than we're used to go away, because there's only so many private companies that are willing to do research. There's only so many foundations that are able to step in and help fund stuff. So I think there's going to be a lot of scarring. I don't think you're going to see public universities disappear. You certainly are seeing a number of small private universities, private colleges disappear, and I think that trend will continue.
David Jesse, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Anytime.
That was David Jesse, senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. What stands out most to me about that conversation is how impactful a lot of these federal policies will be on universities and colleges moving forward. International students subsidizing in-state students, Pell Grants providing that last bit of financing for a low-income student, or the unrestricted endowment funds that go into supporting the general operations of the higher ed institution. Abrupt changes to any of these conditions could cause some short-term pain for colleges and universities that have a longer-lasting impact if there's limited financial flexibility. The Fed is widely expected to leave rates unchanged next week. With no new summary of economic projections, the focus will be on the policy statement and press conference. It's possible Governors Waller and/or Bowman will dissent on the decision to keep rates on hold, a rebuke that would certainly give the president more ammunition in arguing the Fed should start cutting rates soon. During the press conference, we expect the questions to focus on policy expectations, construction at the Fed's headquarters, and the political pressure being placed on Chair Powell. Next week is also busy on the data front. The advanced release of Q2 GDP on Wednesday morning is expected to show annualized growth of just over 2%, a weak rebound considering the 0.3% contraction in the first quarter. Also next week, the June PCE will be released Thursday, and the July jobs report comes out on Friday. Almost half of last month's payrolls growth came from the public sector, giving downside risk to the upcoming employment data. Treasury will announce its borrowing estimate next Monday, followed by how it plans to finance that borrowing on Wednesday. There's a widespread expectation coupon auction sizes will remain unchanged at this refunding announcement, so the biggest variable is how much bill issuance the Treasury plans on over the next 3 months. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening. I'm Will Compernell, macro strategist with FHN Financial. This episode was edited by Bill Stanfield. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Simply Put wherever you get your podcasts. Email simplyput@fhnfinancial.com with any questions or comments. This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.